May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. So I don't know about you all, but when I initially hear our gospel reading this morning, I feel very conflicted about it. We first enter into this moment where Jesus has come and he's being baptized. And as he's coming out of the water, God speaks to Jesus. You are my son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness. It's this clear, direct statement of God's love for Christ, for Jesus, and whom he is. It's this deep love that we hear poured out. And then immediately after that is done, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness for 40 days, where he's going to be tempted by Satan, and he's going to be surrounded by wild animals. I don't know about you, but I feel conflicted about that. How can God in one breath say, you are whom I love, I find happiness in you, and I'm going to send you out into the middle of nowhere, and you're going to have to deal with all of these trials and tribulations? There seems to be an incongruence between the two, and yet this is what Jesus experiences. I wonder if Jesus ever asked himself during those 40 days, is this really loving? Is this really what it means to be in relationship with you, God? I wonder if the people of Israel, the Hebrew children, as they are wandering in the 40 years in the wilderness, if they too asked questions of, Lord, is this what it means to be loved by you? And let's not even think about the 40 years that the Hebrew people spent in the wilderness. Let's talk about the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, Leah and Rachel. They wandered their whole lives in the wilderness. Wilderness and wandering is something that we fear and avoid as a society and as human beings today. We are taught through our society, through our family systems, through just everything we experience, that the wilderness and to wander is a bad thing. It's a scary thing. It's filled with the unknowns. There's terrors hidden behind the unknowingness. And so we avoid it. We flee from it. In fact, we artificially encase ourselves off from the wilderness. We have to look but no further at our town here, where we are surrounded by so much beautiful nature, and yet it's manicured, it's formed, it's boundaried. It's wilderness controlled in a way in which we feel comfortable with it. The world, our lives, our families teach us that wandering is a scary thing. That wandering means you have no purpose or direction in life, and that you're lost when you wander. Everything that we experience tells us not to do it. And yet, Jesus says, God says, follow me. And that following me takes us always into wilderness. And I think when we sit with that for a moment, when we think about what happens in wilderness with God, perhaps it's not as scary as we might think. When we think about the early patriarchs and matriarchs, when God invites them to wander in the wilderness, it gives birth to a new people. It gives birth to a family of people, a group of families of people that go on to give birth to the religious family of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam. Their wandering in the wilderness with God changed the world in ways they never could have imagined. For the Hebrew people, as they came out of slavery in Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and in those 40 years, God changed their hearts and minds from those who have been enslaved and dominated to become a people, a nation freed to live a new way of being. When Jesus goes into the wilderness and he experiences the temptations and the struggles, when he comes out of that wilderness space, he comes out affirmed in what God is compelling him to do without it. When we look at what God does in wilderness spaces, it's nothing short of freeing us to experience something new. In the wilderness, we ourselves, it changes our experience of God. For the here and now, not to wash, but to change wilderness spaces when we are wandering. It's messy and wilderness and want something this Lent. I ponder for us this Lent how God is inviting each and every single one of us to journey into the wilderness, to set aside the things that we try and protect ourselves with, so that we might experience something new. How are we being invited into spaces of discomfort, into spaces of reflection, of instability? Not to set our life off and flip it upside down in a bad way, but to transform our hearts and minds so that we might embrace the freedom God gifts us in this moment. How is God inviting you to embrace wilderness and wandering this Lent? I ponder what God will do through it. Amen.